tensions in Israel are heightened following the discovery of the bodies of 3 Israeli teens who had been missing for weeks. According to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, the Palestinian group Hamas is responsible and, as such, has ordered airstrikes across the Gaza Strip. And to make matters worse, just today, the body of a Palestinian teen was discovered in what his family claims to be a revenge killing by 3 men who forced him into a car and drove away. So to discuss these recent events, as well as the side of the story you won't hear from the corporate press, I'm joined now by journalist and author of Goliath, Fear and Loathing in Greater Israel, Max Blumenthal. Amazing to have you on, Max.
Great to be on with you.
So, Max, start by briefly giving us the most recent updates. What are you hearing happening on the ground during the last 24 hours?
There are clashes in Shufat where the 17-year-old Palestinian boy who was found murdered apparently in a Jewish extremist revenge attack was from. It's a refugee camp in occupied East Jerusalem, and these clashes have been going on for a day. This is following Israel rampaging through the West Bank, abducting over 500 Palestinians, placing almost 200 under administrative detention without charges, raiding universities, killing 6 people while bombing the Gaza Strip, and exacting casualties there. And it's my view that the Israeli government knew from the beginning that the 3 kidnapped and murdered Israeli teens were dead. They knew who the alleged perpetrators were, who the chief suspects were, and they may have even had an idea of where the bodies were from the beginning 2 weeks ago, and that they concealed this information through a gag order from the Israeli public in order to bring us to the crisis where we are today, which has only benefited Netanyahu and his extremely right-wing coalition at the expense of everyone else living under their control.
Right. According to Mondo Weiss, the Israeli government allegedly did know about those circumstances, Max, put a gag order on the case. Really unfortunate. Why do you think that there is that clampdown on information, just to get those tensions heightened?
To unite the Israeli public against Palestinians and behind Netanyahu has carefully staged managed this crisis by, for instance, deploying his wife to introduce the Bring Back Our Boys hashtag. Netanyahu appeared on Israeli media constantly looking at maps. Netanyahu's statement after the 3 kidnapped teens were allegedly found, although they may have been, their bodies may have been discovered earlier, invoked a poem by the famous Jewish poet Chaim Bialik referring to a Jewish massacre in Europe and calling for blood vengeance. So he's explicitly linking this to the Holocaust. He referred to the killers and Hamas as human animals, and his incitement has led directly to the murder of this 17-year-old Palestinian boy apparently abducted by settlers. Now, the Israeli government and its intelligence services and the Palestinian Authority had a recording of a phone call by one of the Israeli teens who were apparently abducted, that and they could hear a gunshot in the phone call. They had known that these teens were dead since sometime around July 14th. Not only that, but it was reported in Palestinian media that the Israeli forces had raided the homes of the Kawasme and Abu Aisha families in Hebron, 10 kilometers from the site of the alleged kidnapping, and accused these their sons of conducting the kidnapping. Those are the 2 suspects who've been announced, but they were announced 2 weeks later. So it's clear to me that the Israeli government has manipulated this situation to avoid a police action, to justify a military action directed at Hamas and the Palestinian Unity government, which has led to the crisis we're seeing today.
And Max, and then you have the housing minister calling for more settlements as a retaliatory measure. I mean, there's a ton of inflammatory rhetoric. There's a lot of tensions heightened right now. Let's take a look at the media coverage in the aftermath. The front page of the New York Times today showed a Palestinian throwing a rock in relation to the story about the Palestinian being murdered. Max, what does this type of framing reveal about the media bias regarding this entire situation?
Well, Jody Rudorin, who's the chief correspondent for the New York Times Jerusalem Bureau, a bureau that is housed in the home of the Karmi family, a Palestinian family who have been ethnically cleansed and who have to ask the New York Times reporters for permission to see their house in West Jerusalem. Jody Rudorin has produced, along with her deputy editor, Isabel Kirshner, articles profiling the 3 killed Israeli teens, humanizing them, deeply empathetic articles about their mothers. There's been very little on the Palestinians who've been killed in Israel's rampage through the West Bank and Gaza Strip, or the Palestinians who've been killed in apparent racist hate crimes, in revenge attacks incited by Netanyahu. Worse is the article today by Rudorin and Kirshner, which waits till the 18th paragraph to discuss the campaign of incitement and the race riots in Jerusalem by Jewish extremists who have been stoked by high-level figures in the Israeli governing coalition. It's clear that the New York Times is engaged in a whitewash of the real sources of this crisis and doing deep disservice to its readers. Beyond that, Abby, I see very little discussion of this crisis and the real roots of it in progressive media.
Right.
And your show is one of the few shows that I see discussing it, even in the alternative online media.
And let's get into that, Max, because according to the Ministry of Information in Ramallah, so many Palestinians have been killed by Israeli forces since the Second Intifada that it equates to 1 being killed every 3 days for the last 13 years. And in fact, 2 Palestinian teens were just gunned down broad daylight on camera last month. I didn't hear the White House issuing condolences for them. Why do you think this latest tragedy is being framed as different, even by alternative media sources, suggesting that because Israeli teens are dead, it somehow makes the playing field equal?
Yeah, we're hearing a lot of rhetoric about a cycle of violence, as if one side isn't the oppressor and the other side isn't oppressed. And we're seeing undue focus on the 3 Israeli victims. Israel, while it rampages through the West Bank, through Jerusalem and Gaza, portrays itself as the victim. And that was Netanyahu's intention from the beginning. That's partly why I think the details of this crime were concealed from the Israeli public. It was to allow Netanyahu to milk this crime for all it was worth, to portray Israel as a victim. And as we've seen time and time again in U.S. media, Israeli Jews are the worthy victims, while Palestinians are unworthy victims. They're unworthy of being humanized. And Jody Rudorin of the New York Times, who recently wrote about one of the boys killed in broad daylight, who you mentioned, on closed caption TV, execution style by an Israeli soldier, referred to him as one among the thousands who died in the struggle against Israel. That is the kind of language that's consistent with the dehumanization of Palestinians in supposedly objective media.
And Max, I'm curious of what your response is to people who say, well, what do you expect Israel to do when rockets are being shot into the country, and what retaliation should be issued for the kidnapping and murder of its citizens?
I expect Israel to decolonize and allow the 80% of the people from the Gaza Strip who are refugees to be allowed to return to their land and property that was taken from them. If you want to understand the roots of Palestinian violent resistance, you can't go back 1 week or 2 weeks or a few years ago or a few intifadas ago. This is not a cycle of violence. It's rooted in a settler colonial apartheid state, which is engaged in an ongoing campaign to dispossess Palestinians of all they have in order to consolidate its ethnic purity. That's the root of this crisis, and that's what we should be talking about, as well as the current round of violence. And this will continue as long as the status quo continues. All of the trends that we're seeing today, including the fascist trends in Israeli society, will deepen and intensify.
Lastly, Max, we have about a minute left, but I wanted to talk about boycott, divestment, sanctions. Noam Chomsky just wrote this article in The Nation saying Palestinian activists need to rethink their strategy. But in it, and I can't read the whole quote because we don't have time, but he basically says that if the road goes ahead in the same route that it is now, it's going to be worse than South Africa. Why do you think that he doesn't support BDS, but still seems to understand the severity of the situation on the ground, that it could be worse than South Africa?
Well, I have a lot of respect for Noam Chomsky. I don't really want to trash him personally, but I've noticed from a lot of critics of BDS who claim to criticize it as allies of Palestinians that they're laundering their own opinions behind a very conservative and even cynical view of reality to limit the the horizons that BDS has expanded, the political horizons, and that's what Chomsky appears to be doing. He's almost asking us to accept the status quo that Israel's imposed and to limit the Palestinian demands in BDS, which is, I think, already demonstrating a lot of great successes. So I think it's really up to those of us who consider us allies of Palestinians, who are in solidarity with the Palestinian struggle for justice, to allow Palestinian civil society to continue to take the lead and to not try to impose our own conditions and our own limitations on their struggle. It's unfortunate that the nation has chosen to publish this.
Thank you so much, Max Blumenthal. Always incredible insight on this crisis. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.